I'm Kim Rogers with Kauai Invasive Species Committee. Behind the scenes, we have Amber Miyake, and today we're here to talk about the planned translocation of the critically endangered ʻEkūpū. ʻEkūpū. I'm sure Sheldon will help me with the pronunciation of that, also known as the Laysan Finch, to Midway Atoll. Our guest speaker is Dr. Sheldon Plentovich. She is a restoration ecologist currently with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Sheldon's academic journey got started at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. She then moved on to Auburn University for a master in wildlife science and eventually to Hawaii for her PhD from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Sheldon's lived in the Hawaiian Islands for the past 25 years, and after working on endangered forest birds in the Mariana Islands at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Sheldon holds a very cool position as Pacific Island Coastal Program Coordinator, where she works with partners to do voluntary collaborative ecosystem restoration. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sheldon. Welcome, Sheldon. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It's good to see you. And okay, let me share my screen.
And while you do that, will you help me with pronunciation?
ʻEkūpū.
ʻEkūpū. Okay, thank you.
And that was gifted by Papahanaumokuakea Cultural Working Group, that name. All right. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to everybody about some of my favorite species, and they would be your favorite too, or maybe they are your favorite if you've been out on any of these islands. The title of this talk today is Facilitating Long-Term Survival and Recovery of Papahanaumokuakea's Endangered Finches Through Translocation. And so obviously a project like this takes just a village of people and organizations to do. We have funding and in-kind support from a variety of organizations, including some of our nonprofits like Hawaii Audubon Society and the Friends of Hawaiian Island National Wildlife Refuge. And then we have, just in-kind support from Pacific Rim Conservation. We're really only able to do this year because of vessel support from NOAA that they're providing free of charge. And so it does take a village, and this is some of our village here. So today I'll start with some background on these species and their status, and then go into a decision-making analysis that we use to select not only which islands to translocate the birds to, but the order of translocation. And then I'll end with some of the translocation planning we're doing in preparation for the first translocation, which will happen in July. Okay, so as many of you know, there are 7 land bird species known from the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. 5 of those were on Laysan, and 2 of them were on Nihoa. And so that's the Laysan and Nihoa finch, the Laysan apapane, the Laysan rail, Laysan duck, and Laysan millerbird. Following a time of resource exploitation on Laysan that started in the late 1800s and included guano mining and egg and feather collection, and it culminated in this dude named Max Schlemmer, who was really he called himself the king of Laysan, and he ended up bringing his family up to Laysan and thought it was a good idea to introduce livestock, including rabbits, which led to the island being denuded. And this is what the island looked like by 1923. And so following that period where most of the vegetation was gone, we know that we lost 3 of our birds, the Laysan apapane, the Laysan rail, and the Laysan millerbird. But we also lost some unknown number of invertebrates and plant species as well. So the surviving passerines in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands are the Laysan finch, or ʻEkūpū, the Nihoa millerbird, or ʻUlulu, and the Nihoa finch, or polyhoa. The ʻUlulu is a small insectivore. It's an old world reed warbler. We successfully translocated it from Nihoa to Laysan in 2011 and 2012. We moved 50 birds total, 24 and 25, or excuse me, 25 birds each year. And since then, the population has increased on Laysan, from those 50 birds to about 600 birds in 2024. And this has led to IUCN downlisting this species from critically endangered to endangered. And so we're hoping to see similar things happen with these finches. So the polyhoa is an omnivore. It's a Hawaiian honey creeper. It's present right now only on Nihoa, although we do expect that it had a much larger range, and I'll get into the evidence for that later. And the population estimate on Nihoa is about 6,500 birds. The ʻEkūpū is also an omnivorous Hawaiian honey creeper. It's present on Kamole or Laysan, and also at Pearl and Hermes or Monavai, where it was translocated in the 70s. The population estimate on Kamole or Laysan is about 17,600 birds, and the population estimate on Monavai is somewhere between 200 and 400 birds. The current threats to all of these populations are, similar to what most small populations deal with. There's highly variable numbers, there's limited habitat, and for some of these species that are on the lower islands, there's sea level rise. There's also a risk of chance events like storms and overwash and fire and invasive species introductions. And then there's also the non-native species that are present on each of their namesake islands, like the gray bird locust on Nihoa, which periodically denudes that island, and Synchus echinatus and Verbicina, which are present on different places in the monument. And then of course there's invasive ants on all of these islands. So translocations have been used since the late 1800s to try to expand the range of these birds. And the goal is to decrease extinction risk by increasing population size and expanding range. And here's a history of land bird translocations in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It was pretty difficult to dig a lot of this up. Some of it just came from my PhD advisor, Sheila Koenitz's, memory. But the ʻEkūpū, or the Laysan Finch, was translocated from Laysan or Kamole to Midway Atoll Sand Island in 1905. And the birds did really well. And 40 years later, they were extirpated due to the introduction of rats. And then in the late 1800s, 1891 and 1910, Kamole ʻEkūpū were translocated from Laysan to Midway Eastern Island. And again, just like Sand Island, those birds did great. And they did great until they were extirpated in 1944. Following the introduction of rats. So those birds would still be there today if the rats weren't introduced. Okay, the next translocation was in 1967. This was also Laysan Finch, ʻEkūpū, from Laysan to Monavai or Pearl and Hermes. And that population did well. And I'll give more details about this in the subsequent slides. The polyhoa or Nihoa finch was translocated in 1967 from Nihoa to Lalo, or French frigate shoals. And the birds didn't thrive, but they did remain present until the early 70s, and they were extirpated by 1974. And there wasn't a lot of monitoring, or maybe there was, but I could not find any details of monitoring. And then the ululu, or the Nihoa miller bird, there was an attempt to translocate it from Nihoa to Moku Manamana in 1968 or 69. Sheila couldn't remember which year, but they couldn't keep the birds alive in captivity on Nihoa, so they actually never left, and so never left for Moku Manamana. And then fast forward to 2011, 2012, Our team translocated the Nihoa miller bird from Nihoa to Kamole or Laysan. You know, we did 25 in 2011, 25 in 2012. And as I mentioned, those birds are doing really, really well. Okay, so just a little more consideration of the ʻEkūpū translocation to Monavai that happened in the 60s. So 110 birds were translocated to Southeast Island in 1967, and then they were moved to the remaining vegetated islands over 6 years. In 1986, there was an estimate that there were more than 800 birds across all the vegetated islands. And then, unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of information from there all the way until the early 2020s. And so, you know, we had an estimate that was pretty anecdotal in 2023 that there were about 100 birds there. But then in 2024, we did a more rigorous surveys, and we estimated that there were between 200 and 400 birds, but they're confined to Southeast Island only, although there is a single bird in the little patch of habitat on North Island, and it has a really wild plumage. It's got these white patches, and it's really interesting. But so that's all that's left. And you know, this population on Monavai is at risk of extirpation due to overwash events. The elevation of the atoll is only about 4 feet, and there are regular washover events related to storm surge and large wave events. So these birds need a new home. Okay, and so these translocations are they're written into the Papahanaumokuakea Monument Management Plan. The strategy is to maintain stable or increasing populations of the Laysan finch, Nihoa finch, and Nihoa miller bird. And the activity is to continue to conduct annual censuses of populations of passerines, and then also to implement translocations of each species and site restoration as needed by developing appropriate techniques for capture, translocation, release, and monitoring. These translocations are also part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service amended recovery criteria, the latest one being 2019. And that calls for viable self-sustaining populations of each species on 2 islands that are resistant to ocean inundation. We'll talk a little bit more about this. Okay, and so when we start thinking about, you know, moving birds to islands that are resistant to sea level rise, we can look into the publications, mostly from Olson and James and Olson, that focus on the subfossil record. And we know that Telespisa, which is the genus for these finches, were once widespread in the lowlands of all the main islands. And there's evidence that there were 2 or more species of the 5 known species likely coexisting in the past on each of the main Hawaiian islands. And so specifically, ʻEkūpū or Laysan finch were found at Barber's Point on Oahu and Elio Point on Molokai. And then the Nihoa finch, Palihoa, occurred at Elio Point and Mo'omomi on Molokai. So we do have some information when we start thinking about moving these birds back to the main Hawaiian islands. So the recovery criteria says a viable self-sustaining population of each species occurring on 2 islands that are resistant to ocean inundation. And, you know, these translocations to the main Hawaiian islands are a ways off, as many people in this webinar know. The finches are, just like all the Hawaiian honey creepers, are especially susceptible to avian malaria. And, you know, having significant areas with mosquito control is a ways off, even though it's so exciting that it's happening. But for something like this, we're still looking at probably 15 or 20 years off. And in addition, we'll need large-scale predator control. Either that could be on an offshore islet like Lehua, or at a place like Kaho'olawe, or, you know, within some kind of predator control fence, say out at Mo'omomi at Mokio or something. So these translocations where we're moving birds, say off Monavai to Eastern Island, is a way that we can buy time. So translocations to predator-free low islands will reduce extinction risk and then also provide source populations for translocations to high islands when the time is right, a couple of decades from now. Okay, so how do you pick like which species, what's the order and which islands, are most appropriate? And to be honest, this was a really challenging thing to do because we've been talking about this since we finished the Uluru translocations back in 2012, and we're having trouble coming up with a way to get buy-in from everyone to start working on the finches. And so luckily Rachel Rounds led a SWOT analysis, and this is an analysis that focuses on strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This slide is for me to remember to mention that there are some really cool native endemic arthropods on Nihoa, such as this giant trapdoor spider that's fluffy and friendly and spends its whole life, which can be longer than 50 years, in a burrow. And that's just one of a million cool species of arthropods on Nihoa. But back to finches and SWOT analysis. So the objectives of the SWOT analysis were to compare and rank potential translocation sites for creating additional populations of Polyhoa and ʻEkūpū. The SWOT analysis, as I mentioned, stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And we wanted to prioritize which species to move first and where to move them. We had concerns about hybridization, even though we know, based on the fossil record that some of the species co-occurred. We're still had some concerns about hybridization at this point in time. So we decided that we weren't going to move birds to the same island. And then we also had some concerns about disease. And so we didn't want to mix any of the source populations. Okay, so the SWOT definitions that sort of guided this analysis are strength indicators, which refer to inherent aspects of habitat quality, like how big is the island, what kind of food availability, are there nest sites, say for cliff nesters. Weakness indicators are intrinsic natural factors that reduce quality. So are there native predators? Are there lots of hurricanes that come through this area? Threat indicators are extrinsic or anthropogenic factors that reduce quality. So maybe invasive competitors or invasive predators or introduced diseases. And then the final one, these opportunity indicators, are any conservation strategies or management conditions that might increase the suitability of an area for translocation. So is the area a protected area? So you don't have to worry about, development, or is there existing support infrastructure? Or for us, like, does NOAA have a SEAL camp there so that we can, be part of to help monitor some of these translocated birds? Okay, and so the process went like this. We assembled our SWOT team, and I'll share those members in a second. We selected potential release sites. We selected environmental indicators or criteria. We collected all the background information on the indicators by talking to people, by doing literature reviews. And then we weighted relative importance of each indicator to the species translocation, scored the indicators, and then reviewed the final scores. So here's the team, folks from refuges and ecological services within U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then we had Chris from American Bird Conservancy, Cynthia from DOFAW, Sheila Conant from UH, and then Noah Gomes from the Monument Cultural Working Group. The potential release sites that we selected were based on expert elicitation that was led by Morin and Conant in 2007. And so the three release sites were Lisiansky or Kauō, Midway Atoll, and then Hōlaniku or Kiri Atoll. And when we ranked these release sites for each species, it ended up being the same for both species. So for Polyhoa and ʻEkūpū. And so Kauō or Lisiansky was the best release site for both species, followed by Hōlani, and then Kalamanu or Eastern Island was the third for both species. So then we went on to prioritize species. So we evaluated, that was evaluated for Polyhoa and for ʻEkūpū on Kamole. And we weighted each threat on a scale of 10 to 100. So we looked at the population size of the ʻEkūpū on Kamole and the Polyhoa, which is on Nihoa. So this is not considering Monavai, which we considered separately, and I'll explain why in a second. But so what we did is we looked at population size, population abundance variability, non-native predators on their namesake islands, food, water resource availability, risk of fire, risk of inundation within the translocation timeframe. And these are the results. So remember that the lower scores represent a greater threat to the species. So if you look here in the bottom, Polyhoa came out as more of a priority than ʻEkūpū on Laysan or Kamole. And some of the main reasons for that is that the Polyhoa has a lower population size. Remember, lower scores represent a greater threat. It also has significantly more variability in the population size. There are more significant non-native species that are threats on that island as well. So that's how Polyhoa came out as the priority. Now, the case for ʻEkūpū on Monavai, which is Pearl Hermes, remember this is the population that was translocated in the 60s, and it used to be 800 plus, and now we're down to about, probably around 300 birds. And so this population has persisted for about 60 years, but in recent years, there's been this winter overwash associated with storms and large wave events. And unfortunately, Verbicina and Celluloides was introduced to the atoll. And so what happens is, the birds were already having a hard time. And if you talk to anybody who's been to Monavai, they'll tell you stories about these birds, like hitching a ride when they leave the island in the small boat, like, please take me away. But they're very aggressive and good at utilizing all resources available. But when Verbicina was introduced, it made things even worse in that the Verbicina kind of dies off part of the year, and the birds use it for cover. The Verbicina is outcompeting some of the native plants. And so for part of the year, the birds have limited cover and just limited resources. So the discussion in the workshop, when we were talking about this population, was, should we move them back to Laysan or Kamole? What are the genetic and behavioral differences between the two populations? And there are some, and there's published information on this. What's a disease risk, about potentially moving them back to Kamole. So we weren't down to take that risk. Another option would be to leave them on Monavai, but the outlook is not good for continued persistence on that atoll because it's such low elevation, and it's already seeing these impacts from climate change, most notably just the washover of the entire islets. And so what we decided on was move them to a different island. Okay, so the workshop outcomes were Polyhoa, we wanted to move to Kauō, which is Lisiansky. So that's the most threatened population was Polyhoa, to move to the first choice, which is Kauō. And then the ʻEkūpū and Kamole would go to Hōlani, but ʻEkūpū and Monavai were the priority for translocation, just because they're uncertain future, and they'll be going to Kalamanu or Eastern Island. Okay, so once that was done, we had to jump into translocation planning. So For where, we did the SWOT workshop. We got, we duked it out and we all agreed upon the outcome. And then we went to the WHO, there are many partners. There's a dedicated core of team experts within ES and refuges, monument staff, DLNR, and then nonprofits. And then the WHO, in terms of which birds and how many, this was informed by literature review and our prior experience, along with population monitoring. And then moving on to the how, we're started tackling logistics and infrastructure, vessel charter, which we ended up not needing for this first translocation thanks to NOAA. And then started tackling how are we going to capture these birds, husbandry, transport, release, monitoring protocols, and then finally fundraising. And then we also are in the process, we're pretty much finished with this, but we're tying up the last few ends of the risk assessment, which includes a ESA 10A 1A permit, which is a recovery permit, and a Section 7 consultation. Section 7 under the Endangered Species Act, just we just needed to evaluate how this was going to impact the birds we're moving, but also the ecosystems that are receiving them. And then the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 consultation for cultural resources, a NEPA review, and then permits for work within Papahanaumokuakea. So those are almost done. And then we've been working on a translocation plan that's founded on the IUCN guidelines for, we've probably been working on it for almost a year now. And we have our final draft. It's out for peer review. If anyone wants to review it, let me know. But we have review from the working group, and then as well as folks within the agencies, and then other experts outside the agency and outside the US that are also reviewing it. So we're going to complete the regulatory compliance, and then we're planning to move the Manawai ʻEkūpū to Kalamanu or Eastern Island, starting, we head up there on January 15th. And the plan at Manawai, is a little different from the plan when we moved Palihoa, because at Manawai, we're trying to get as many birds as we can. And so we thought, after talking to our aviculturists, we think that we can move up to 100 birds. And so we have all of the transport and holding and release cages are completed for that. And we're hoping that, we can capture and move 100 birds. As I mentioned, NOAA is providing the vessel time free of charge. Our team's going to depart. We fly to Midway on the 15th, and we're getting picked up by NOAA on the 16th. There'll be this 8-hour transit to Manawai, and then we have 2 to 4 days to capture all the birds. And then we'll have an overnight transit back. We'll leave in the evening. We'll arrive back at Midway in the morning. And then we'll be releasing the birds the next day. We're going to put glue-on transmitters on 20 of the birds, and then all the birds will be color banded so that they can be resighted and tracked. And we'll also be using trail cams and song meters to monitor the population, as well as personnel on Midway. We have a 3-person team that's going to stay on the island for 2 weeks and do the daily radio tracking. And then for the long term, we're hoping that the birds can be monitored 2 times a week at Midway. So that's the plan. And you can all imagine, like, with everything federal agencies are facing right now, this has obviously been a challenge to plan amidst all of that uncertainty. So this is a drawing that Alana Nims did for this translocation. And if you're interested in it, I don't know if you can see, but I got my shirt on right now. And you can buy the shirt. It's a bonfire fundraiser. But we do have, all the main funds that we need. But if you are interested in contributing, you could buy finch food or supplies for some of the cages that we haven't reimbursed Peter for yet. So yeah, buy a shirt, feed a finch. They also have, oh yeah, this cool little, I don't know if you can see it, like travel mug. And then I think the clay figurine workshop is done. I don't think they're planning to do another one, but this was from Friends of Hawaiian Island Refuges. And with that, I'll take questions.
Wow, Sheldon, amazing.
Oh, thanks.
The amount of work and effort and time and thinking, I mean, so thoughtful, so dedicated, so thorough. I mean, almost as impressive as that 50-year-old trapdoor spider. I mean,
I know nothing's more impressive than the Nihoa puppy spider.
I know. I do want to talk more about that at some time because, oh my gosh, right? But
They're the coolest things, and they are in such big trouble because of the invasive ants on the island, and it's definitely something that keeps me up at night, but we can talk
okay.
about it later.
Promise me next year for a High Sam webinar, we'll devote it to
Oh yeah, 100%. But I'm gonna end up showing you videos of these giant spiders being attacked by black crazy ants, Paratrichina longicornis, and it's gonna make everybody want to cry.
Oh man, that's disappointing. I
Yeah.
do want to remind everybody, drop questions in the chat or the Q&A, whichever function you prefer to use. And meanwhile, while people are thinking their questions, and I have some for you too, but I just want to remind folks while we have everybody here that our next and last webinar of the month for Hawaiian Invasive Species Awareness Month is at 2 o'clock Hawaii time. And we'll be back at Midway talking about, the title is From Weeds to Wildlife. So it's the plant team there working at, eradicating some invasive weeds, and outplanting native plants and obviously restoring habitat. So you can still sign up for that. I think we'll probably drop the link in the chat. If Amber would do that, that would be great. Also, so question for you. ʻEkūpū. What is their flight range?
Oh yeah, like how far? Well, that's a great question, right?
Because
And
why haven't they naturally moved
yeah,
from
um,
Kamole
so
north
right,
to
um,
Kauō, right?
that's a great question. And birds, if you look into the literature for passerines, even barriers like a river can be substantial for birds. And
Interesting.
so I think for birds on Kamole, not being able to see any land in any direction or have any indication just means they stay on the island.
What
Um,
is the distance between Kamole and Kauō?
um, a long way. It's
Is
like
it okay?
two days by boat, a day by boat. I'd have to look. It's for me, it's like at least 24 hours of vomiting, so it's hard to remember exactly how much.
Depending
But
on the boat you're on, yes.
right. But we do there was some indication that when birds were translocated to Montevideo, that they were physically translocated to all of the vegetated islets in the atoll, but there was some indication that some birds were moving some of those distances themselves. And so something that we spent a fair amount of time discussing is if we translocate these birds to Kalamanu or Eastern Island, when are they going to go to Sand Island? And because that's a
Right.
good consideration, right? And so, yeah, we don't think that that's going to happen. I mean, in our brains, just looking at the paucity of resources and good habitat at Montevideo, in our brains, the birds are going to get to Eastern and high five us and go eat a duck egg, or whatever. But
And go, well done. Thank you very much.
yeah. I mean, but who knows? I mean, and that is something that we've considered in our risk assessment.
Okay. Yeah. So similar to that question, Keith Swindle is asking, when ʻEkūpū were moved to Eastern and Sand Islands at Midway in the past, was there any evidence that did or did not move between those islets on their own? So basically,
That's a great question. And I did try to dig some of that up, and there wasn't any evidence. However, they didn't have the birds well marked. They weren't well monitored back in the day, when they were moving birds around. but it's wild to think that those birds would still be there if the rats weren't introduced, right? And then they had also translocated Laysan rail to Midway, and it persisted until the rats extirpated it, so longer than it persisted on Laysan. That's the other thing that just is like, like, anyway, but yeah, so Keith, there is surprisingly little information about dispersal in those early translocations that I can find, and I've looked pretty hard.
So those translocations, I want to go back even further, those early ones, like late 1800s, early
Yeah.
1900s. Was that for the same reason why we do translocations today?
Yeah, they were just like, you know, and they didn't have the benefit of subfossil evidence showing that the birds were widespread, but it was the same folks doing it, all Sheila's buddies, and they were doing it, you know, to try to increase population and expand range of those species. And it's just, yeah, there, you know, the best one was the movement of birds up to Midway, but unfortunately,
Yeah.
for the rats.
Okay, Johnny Shepard is asking, how long are the birds held before release on the new island?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Monavai will be the shortest period of time. The Monavai to Eastern Translocation will be the shortest period of time. But on island, the longest they'll be held is 3 days. The transit is 8 hours, and then they're going to be released the next morning. So birds aren't going to be held for longer than 6 days max on this translocation. But the other translocations are, you know, there's a longer transit time. And so we estimated, I think in the translocation plan, we estimated the worst case scenario, birds would be held for like 11 days. And for miller birds, which are way harder to care for, the insectivores, we had on island captive care trials, and we were able to keep them and have them do well for 8 days. So we think that for the finches, which we joke around that the finches eat dirt, because for a while we couldn't figure out what they were eating because it did look like they were just eating dirt. But the finches eat everything. And so we don't anticipate, based on the knowledge of the group, and then also Peter Luscombe, who's our aviculturist, he has cared for the finches before at the Honolulu Zoo. And so we think, you know, 11 days will be okay.
So Amanda Naveen asks, do the proposed translocation islands have many seabird species?
Oh, yeah.
Noisy and complicate the bioacoustic monitoring, and bioacoustic analysts are curious.
Yes, this is all stuff we've spent a lot of time talking about. So all those islands in Papahanaumokuakea have a ton of seabirds, like think, you know, 2 seabirds every square meter, you know, above ground, below ground, whatever. And you're right. So we are definitely not going to put our acoustic monitoring near where we think there'll be sooty tern colonies, because we wouldn't hear anything. And we're working with USGS, assuming we all don't get fired. We're working with USGS to try to use this as a trial to see if we can use those acoustic monitors to do more than just presence absence, to potentially look at a way to estimate density more like you would on a count. And so we did a trial at Nihoa this year where we're doing our regular seabird counts, which are variable circular plot point counts, but we also used the song meter to record at the same time we were doing the point counts. And it seemed like this initial data, which has just been the first run through, we think we can do something with the finches, but the miller birds are a no-go because their call is like, if they're not singing, even their song isn't very loud, but their call is like this. And so you can imagine that's
I couldn't even hear that.
Yeah, it's like impossible to hear, and it sounds just like a naughty chick as well. So yeah, we think we can do something, but this is, you know, some novel research that's going to be happening, and we really hope we can use those acoustic monitors, but the trail cam should be good on water sources. We know we'll be able to see a bunch of the finches. Hopefully it's good enough to read some of the bands, but we'll see.
Yeah, great. So I know you addressed the idea of perhaps someday, 15, 20, 30 years, translocating some of these birds that are endemic to the monument to the main Hawaiian Islands, where there won't be washover events and whatnot. But the big roadblock, of course, is avian malaria, mosquitoes. Grr. Um, so apparently there are no mosquitoes in the monument, correct?
Well, there are mosquitoes at Midway, and this was why Midway ranked third for the 3 sites. And what we did is we had carcasses from, I think it was either 50 or 75 canary and minas, and we had Evan Paxton at USGS analyze them for Plasmodium. It's because we don't think we have mosquitoes at Eastern, but we know they're at Sand on Midway. And so our question was, you could have mosquitoes, but if you don't have the Plasmodium, you don't have avian malaria, right? And there's no evidence of avian malaria, from looking at any of the birds there. And so what we did is we had the canaries and the minas checked, and we found no evidence of the Plasmodium. So, that's why we wouldn't move Nihoa finch there,
The
but
possibility.
yeah, but we feel okay about doing the Monavai birds that are going to be gone soon anyway, if we don't move them. And that's really the only choice. But yeah, but for a long time when we talked about this, Midway was off the table. But then we went ahead and took that extra step to have the passerines analyzed, and we're stoked to hear, that Plasmodium's not there.
Are there proactive measures against mosquitoes at Sand Island, like dunk treatment, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure of the details, but they have, I know they've done some work at Cure where they've also found mosquitoes. They previously, but I don't think they've found them in a while. So there have been some measures, and I'm not sure of the latest what's happening, but I know it has occurred in the past.
Yeah. Okay. So Johnny Shepard is back. Thank you, Johnny. He's asking, are there any demographic considerations involved when choosing which birds to translocate? For example, will you leave gravid females or juveniles behind?
Great question.
Like that question.
Yeah. Yes. And of course, definitely. So if you look at the research of translocations of passerines, there's been different hypotheses, like younger birds will do better or older birds will do better. But in the end, it's a mix of birds that does well. And so that's our plan, is to get a mix. If the birds have brood patches or a cloacal protuberance, which indicates recent breeding, or they'll be breeding soon, we won't be taking those birds. And our team has been going out, many of us haven't done that in a while, looked for brood patches and cloacal protuberances. So we've been working with the Vine Project here. We've been going up and mist netting and doing all the morphological measurements, because we're about to have in our hands, every finch population over the next few years. So we're going to make sure to take all the measurements so that we can detect changes, because even 20 years after the birds were moved to Monavai, their bills were changing. And Sheila hypothesized that it was because they were handling tribulus seeds. And I don't think there's any tribulus on that island right now. So it'll just be interesting to see what happens. But aside from that, yeah, if there's any evidence of a brood patch or a cloacal protuberance, or we see dependent fledglings, we will not be taking those birds.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, it looks like we've gotten to the end of our questions, unless somebody pops one in at the last go, which is more than welcome. We do have a couple minutes left. But I want to say thank you so much, Sheldon. This has been fabulous. And thank you to everybody who showed up today.